Hey guys, I'm NPC, and about a month ago, someone recommended to make a list regarding the enemies, and I thought that was a really good idea. And while I do want to get right into it as soon as possible, there are a few things I need to get out of the way before we can start this list. Last time I kind of made like a fighting game tier list for the playable characters, so for this time around, I'm going to be making a top 14 kind of list solely because the enemies aren't really as complicated as the players, so I kind of found it more efficient to put it in a kind of top 14, top 10 style kind of list instead of a genuine FGC fighting game style tier list. And now I'm going to quickly explain how I'm going to grade them on the list. There's two big factors. The first one, how often do you fight the enemy? And secondly, how much of a problem they are throughout the game, or whenever you fight them, if you will. Health will be considered, but not too much, solely because the characters you play as in this game can do quite a lot of damage, so it's not really a big factor compared to the other ones. Now, I know there are a lot of variations of enemies in this game, but I'm going to compile every variation of an enemy as one entity on this list, solely because the variations don't have that many differences to make them a separate entity on the list. And last but not least, I will not be including Nora on this list for a few reasons. One, she's technically a boss character, and two, you only fight her kind of once as a minion throughout the entire game, and she's kind of the only one with this weird situation where she's a boss and a minion at the same time. So due to this rather unorthodox scenario, I will not be including her on this list. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, determining who was the weakest enemy in this entire game was quite challenging to think about. But after putting a lot of thought into it, I've come to the conclusion that the cop is the weakest enemy in the game. Now, there are 4 variations of this character. All of them are able to gut punch you in a certain way, and higher versions of the character are able to grab you in their own unique way. And while you do fight them quite a bit throughout the game, they just seem to be the most harmless out of all the enemies. In almost 99% of the cases, they usually just walk up and get absolutely obliterated with nothing to retaliate. The only variation that really stands any sort of chance is the black cop, which comes with a taser. And at first, they used to be the most annoying enemy for me. However, if you jump kick them or somehow grab their taser and take it away, they're pretty much as weak as the other cops. The other type of throws the red and green cop have are also pretty harmless. You can get out of them without getting hit 90% of the time. Overall, this character just seems like a walking punching bag and is never that much of a threat at all. Next up on this list is going to be the Karate, which is what they're called in the game files, or known as Goro when you fight them in the game. Now, there are 2 variations of this character, one being white and one being red, the white ones being the more elite ones in this case. These characters are by far the most gimmicky out of all the characters. I'd also say when you first fight them are one of the most difficult to deal with, that is until you learn how to throw them. And while sure their parry can be very annoying, they have nothing to retaliate against you throwing them and doing a lot of damage. And considering every time you fight them, especially the elite version, they're only by themselves or accompanied with another one of their own kind, so you can pretty much throw them without any issues at all. As for the red ones, which also have a parry and can chase you down and do their multi-punch attack, simply walking away from them or just hitting them when they run at you is all you need to do. Their quote-unquote super fast attack can be countered pretty much by anything you do before they can even attack you. And as I mentioned before, you only fight them in 2 stages throughout the entire game, and every time you fight them, they're pretty much harmless. So while very annoying at first, once you learn how to counter them, they're pretty much one of the easiest enemies to take out. The next character up is going to be the Agent. Now, there are 4 variations of this character. Well, really only 2, but 3 skin color swaps of 1 variation, I should say. The first 3 basically just walk around slowly and shoot 1 bullet. The second version, Bronze, can shoot up to 3 times and with armor. They appear quite a bit near the end of the game and appear in situations where they're fairly annoying. But annoying is the worst they can ever possibly be. This is because they heavily rely on the other units accompanying with them. Besides that, they are pretty much dog shit on their own and get absolutely wrecked. Not too much to say with this character, just kind of a nuisance when they come around, but other than that, they're pretty easy to beat and one of the weakest enemies in this game. Next up is the signals, and when I refer to the signals, I mean Y signal, D signal, you get the point. An enemy who has not changed anything since the very first game. They have 4 variations, but the only difference is health. He has a kind of knockdown punch, a slide, and a overhead throw. What is going for them for this list is the fact that you fight them throughout the entire game. And while there isn't anything wrong with them necessarily, they're just kind of outshined by the other enemies when it comes to being a nuisance in this game. The other big problem with this enemy is the fact that everything comes out quite slow and is quite reactable compared to many of the attacks in this game. As long as you know how to recover from his overhead throw or just jump kick a lot, you'll pretty much avoid anything he can throw at you. This next one might be a surprise, and that's going to be Kobo, the giant skull robot. There are 2 variations in this game, but one of them you only find near the very, very end of the game. He can spawn a mace or pipe, depending on the variation, can hit you with it with pretty long range, do a jump stomp, and spawn weapons to hover against you. His second variation can do multiple jump stomps at once. Now, while he is a mini-boss, he just doesn't seem to be the problem in the room ever in any of the situations given. While this character looks and may sound intimidating, he just seems to be outshined by the other enemies he's always accompanied with. So, in short, he's never really the elephant in the room. And if you think he could stand on his own as a mini-boss, you have to think again, as he's one of the few big characters you can actually infinite. Just do 3 quick punches, wait, and then do another 3, and he'll never be able to get out of it or activate any moves at all. So despite being big, intimidating, and having a lot of health, he just doesn't seem to be as scary as the other guys you fight. The next character on this list is going to be Victoria. Victoria has 2 attacks. One is a kind of evasive push, and what she's more known for is her projectile, which depends on her variation. One does acid, another is fire, the other is a grenade, and the last one is electricity. Out of these 4, the only one that's pretty useless is the acid one. This is because an acid puddle is just not that intimidating compared to the other ones at least. Sure, it slows you down, but there's a lot of characters that can run or dash out of it, and if you don't have those, you can simply jump out of it pretty quickly. As for the other 3, it really varies on the situation. Probably the most difficult part in the game that has these characters is in stage 10 when you're fighting the elite versions of Sugar, with a Golden Donovan and them throwing grenades from the heavens. And perhaps in stage 11 where the electricity ones are throwing electricity at you, but that isn't as difficult because it can be used to your advantage and actually damage the shields and even hurt the other enemies around her. unlike in Stage 10, where the grenades do not actually harm the other enemies at all, making the grenade Victoria the most deadly. While there isn't too much to say about this enemy, the main thing is they're good for catching you off guard, and that's about it. But they do a pretty good job at it, especially when they are accompanied with a crowd of enemies. Next on the list is the Elite. Now, while normally the variations don't make much of a difference, in this case, some of the variations are completely different. The Elite has 4 variations, and for the majority of them, they only have one attack, which is a strike with whatever weapon they're using. And when they're unarmed, they will try and punch you, but this punch is incredibly slow, and you'll usually never get hit by it. Probably the most annoying part is the fact that they have a shield, which is pretty tough to beat. If you're not careful, you're going to get hit out of this, and they'll be able to recharge their shield, which can be very annoying. Now, the first 2 variations are the same thing, just a color swap. The tan one, however, is equipped with a taser rather than a baton, which is a lot worse to deal with, as when you are tased, you have very little window of opportunity to actually escape. The last one is by far the most unique variation out of all of them, as instead of being a slow turtle shield with a baton or taser, they are a super agile ninja that can annoy you with shurikens, and can block any projectile you throw at them. If you were to ask me, however, this enemy had a lot of wasted potential to be a threat to the player. While they can be annoying with their shield, if you know when to get out of the way at the right time, usually you're going to break their shield the second time, or after the first time they attack. And once they have their shield gone, they're pretty much defenseless. As for the ninja variation, they could have been a whole lot worse. However, they're only in one part of the game, thankfully, and they're not too problematic to deal with. But they could have been a whole lot worse if they were put in certain parts of the game. Maybe it is a good thing that this guy, of all things, wasn't too much of a hassle throughout the game, but he definitely can still be annoying. And speaking of appearances, he appears quite often throughout the game, or usually when there's cops around. While a very interesting enemy for sure, I'd say he's around the middle of the road when it comes to annoyances and being a problem throughout the entire game. Following that on the list is going to be Big Ben. Big Ben has 4 variations and has a slap attack and a alternate attack which varies on the variation you fight. The first one will chase you and breathe fire. The second one will jump at you. The third and fourth one are the same and will just kind of roll around. Now, these guys you fight quite frequently throughout the game, so you'll expect to see them quite often. As for how much of a problem they are, really only 2 of the 4 variations actually cause any issues. More so, the second one, which jumps around, is much more of a problem than any of the other 3, with the flaming one being in second place and the other 2, or the last variation where they just roll around, being the least problematic. The reason the jumping one is the worst is because it kind of is the same attack of the flaming one, just a lot faster and covers ground much quicker, not to mention is in the air, and enemy aerial attacks can be quite challenging to counter compared to the flame attack, which yes, has a large hitbox and can be very hostile. However, if you get out of the way, you can usually avoid it, and they take a long time to recover. Which is kind of the main thing, or issue I should say, with this enemy, is that he takes forever to do an attack. If he was a little faster or more versatile like he was in previous games, mainly Streets of Rage 2, he would be a much deadlier enemy. But because they kind of dumbed him down for each variation, he's a lot less hostile than he was in the past. However, I will give him credit as he's one of the few enemies that can kind of stand on his own. This character will never be a pushover, is what I'm trying to say. This next enemy gives me personal beef, but I need to put my own personal issues aside here and talk about Dylan. Now, Dylan has 4 variations, but to my knowledge, there is only 3 real variations. The one thing they do have in common is that they kind of crouch and charge at you somehow. Their attacks all seem to be uniquely different from what I've seen. The first two are fairly similar. They both have this kind of slow kick, and they can do this aerial counterattack. Now, the first two variations are rather harmless. They kind of are just like walking punching bags. However, every now and then they will catch you with their aerial attack. While the first two variations might not be too much of an issue, the other one is much more of a problem. You see, for the first two, when they do their kind of charge, they run at you and try and kick you. However, with the upgraded versions, the yellow one and pink one, they will do this fruity jump kick, I like to call it, where they'll do 3 aerial kicks, and they're incredibly hard to counter, and this makes them, in my opinion, the king of catching you off guard. I can't tell you how many times I've been trying to take out one enemy and forget that one of them is going to jump at me with their really long range, far traveling 3-hit kick. Starting on level 3 is when you find the upgraded versions, while the regular ones you find throughout the entire game. What doesn't help is the fact that when they get up, they have this really obnoxious armored wake-up attack, which can ruin things and throw you even more off guard if you're not careful, especially when you're too close to them when they're on the ground. While I wouldn't say they're the absolute worst, they can become a massive issue if you're not giving them attention. Essentially, this enemy forces you to multitask, and if you don't do so, you will not be getting what you need. Overall, a very frustrating character to deal with, to say the least. Next up is Diamonds, the jumping chick, if you will. This enemy has 4 variations, however, 3 of them are basically just skins, and one of them is their own unique variation. Both of them have a kind of wake up bitch slap, where if you're too close to them, they'll do the bitch slap. And what makes them even worse is that they have a leaping jump kick. They have 2 attacks. One is a wake up, or when too close to, bitch slap attack. And they also have a jump kick, which can hit you from any direction. So remember the special version of Big Ben that can hit you anywhere, but now imagine every single enemy having that. While there are not many bosses like Big Ben, you find a way more of them throughout the entire game. The upgraded version, while you would think would be worse, actually is not as bad if you ask me. And this is because their jump is changed from a slow, long range jump to a quick, fast jump. The reason I think this is weaker is because it does not cover as much ground, so spacing yourself further from the elite versions will make it harder for them to approach you. While as the lower rank ones, which you A, find more, they also B, have way more range and can hit you from much further distances, which makes them much more of a threat if you ask me. Worst of all, it has amazing anti-air. It pretty much beats everything except for your defensive special. Heck, it even feels like the only way to counter the move is use your defensive special. The only other attack that I can even think of that can even counter this is Soar 3 Blaze's Blitz attack. But besides that, nothing really else can beat their jump kick, making it very difficult to deal with, and something you kind of have to just walk around rather than personally deal with. Overall, quite a difficult enemy to deal with, and an annoying one at that. Next up, we have Raven, and this one is a really tough one to deal with. Raven has 4 skins, but only 2 real variations. They have 3 attacks, one which is a kind of multi-kick string. They can grab you, they can do kind of a one-hit string that just knocks you down, and they have a jumping knee. Oh, worst of all, I forgot to mention, they can also block. Upgraded ones, the only difference is the knee jump they do has this fiery animation, and it goes further with armor. So a pretty tough move to deal with. And if I'm not mistaken, it can hit you across the entire screen if you're not careful. The absolute worst thing about them is the fact that they can block. This is something that's incredibly dangerous if you're trying to get an S rank or speed run, because if you're trying to approach them, not only can they always throw an attack whenever they want to, but there's a good chance there's other enemies around trying to stop you. And approaching them while they're blocking is a very risky thing to do at times, because you just don't know what's going to happen. And you better pray, like I said, there's not going to be a bunch of enemies around trying to screw you over. Overall, this enemy is an absolute nightmare to deal with at times, and is also one of the few enemies that can stand by themselves without needing too much assistance. They're kind of one of the more independent enemies, if you ask me, and can be just as a problem by themselves, or with just another one accompanied with them. Next up on this list is Sugar, as they're called, the female biker chicks. There are 4 versions of this character, and depending on the variation, the attacks vary. All of them share the headbutt charge and a ground kick. When you're on the ground, they'll kick you once or twice, and it's armored. The headbutt, they slowly charge up, and then they come at you very quickly, knocking you down. The higher up variations can go further, and even in other directions besides just straight in front of them. And they gain armor while charging up. However, it does take them a little longer to do so, so you have a little more time to react. The final version, which you only fight one in the entire game, thank God, Candy, is armored throughout the entire animation. And I also forgot to mention that the Elite 2 gain a special throw where they turn red, and if they grab you, they body slam you. This enemy is one tough son of a bitch, if you ask me, and can be very annoying with a group or on their own. Thankfully, they don't appear too early in the game, as they appear on stage 5, which is kind of midway through the game. And thankfully, the higher up versions don't appear too early in the game, but the same can't be said for late game, where there are a lot of high level versions of this character attacking you constantly. And for me, they've seemed to be placed in spots throughout the game where it is really convenient for them to fuck with you hard. I think the designers did a really good job making them as hard as possible to deal with in this case. For example, near the end of the game, you fight a couple of diamonds and I think 1 or 2 elite sugars, but I think that varies on difficulty. Anyways, this is a very scary part in the game, especially on Mania, because if one of the bikers were to headbutt you in the wrong direction, you'll wake up the elite version, which spawns even more enemies. So if there wasn't enough enemies in that spot, there'll be even more, and they'll be even more horrendous. Overall, this character seems to be really good at putting you in a really shit situation, and is usually accompanied with a lot of health. Overall, this is definitely a very tough enemy to deal with, and is definitely one of the top 3 for sure. Next up is the one and only Galaxia. Now, this is rather interesting to have this high in the list, because in theory, you would say, aren't they the weakest possible enemies in the game? If we were playing Streets of Rage 2, I would say yes. But since we are over 30 years into the future now, times are a little different. There are 5 versions of Galaxia, but the only difference in this case, once again, is health. And they only have one attack, which is a light punch. That is, if they don't have any weapons, of course. Now, this enemy without weapons isn't too much of an issue, especially if you're fighting a lot of them, but the game completely changes when they have a knife or a melee weapon they can pick up of any sort. The problem actually is more of a mechanical thing in the game. You see, the hitbox of the move is very unorthodox, I would say. And they're always really good at aligning themselves with you not being able to hit them even though they're running at you. The AI seems to be really good at this. Even though they take a little bit of time to charge up their next run, they usually put themselves in a corner once they hit you to run at you again in another awkward spot, making it very challenging to deal with. It may not have as much range, so to say, as the Big Bens, but you do need to keep in mind that this is an enemy you fight throughout the entire game. From the moment you walk in till the very, very end of the game, you will never escape this guy. He is always there to haunt you and pick up a knife and chase you down. Heck, sometimes it's going to be 3 or 4 of them with a knife chasing you down. My point is especially proven on stage 6, when you encounter the army of Galaxias. This stage, or part of the stage I should say, is only scary for one reason, and it's because they have the ability to pick up the weapons in this area. For example, the giant kabuki staff. If one of them gets a hold of it, it's an absolute nightmare to deal with, and it's almost like you're guaranteed to lose a life at some times, especially if you're playing a character like Shiva who can't even pick up weapons. Not to mention that they can do a shit ton of damage. So in short, an enemy that you fight throughout the entire game, always in mobs, always swarming you, and can be a nightmare at the same time. And in this list, it's a recipe to become one of the worst. But of course, the one thing this character lacks is the fact that by themselves, they only have one weenie move and they're designed to get wrecked. But the same can't be said for the final entry on this list. The man, the myth, the legend, the one and only Donovan. Before I even begin, one thing you probably did notice is that a lot of the variations have versions that are complete shit and versions that might be a lot stronger or a lot more problematic. And that might not even be always the tougher versions. With Donovan, all of them are a massive problem, especially the higher up versions. Now, there are 3 real variations, but 4 skins, 2 of them connected to the first variation. They are accompanied with a similar Galaxia punch, but also have a uppercut move, which is stupid, and can also pick up weapons like pipes and katanas. Now, while many people might agree or disagree with the placements I've had for all the other characters, I think majority of people who have played this game at a high level are going to strongly agree that Donovan is one of the worst enemies in this game to deal with. And it's not because of his design or how he was made, but more of a functional thing if you ask me. Either I'm just super trash, or every time I've fought Donovan, they seem to be some of the smartest AI in this entire game, if not the smartest AI. Because despite their attacks being incredibly annoying, they have a perfect sense of timing, it feels like. For example, they'll be sitting just above your head after you do an attack, and then come in and punch you immediately when you don't have enough time to recover. Another example is you may be using a melee weapon or even spamming your special, and they'll be just out of range for you not to hit them and may have an opportunity to run up and hit you. Even worse is their aerial uppercut. This move absolutely dominates the player. Not because its properties are that bad, but because the Donovan AI is so fucking ridiculous at times, they'll pretty much anti-air you no matter what. Now, if this already wasn't horrible enough, from what it seems, the alternate versions, or the other 2 variations, I should say, get even worse than that. Not only are they accompanied by the OP AI and godlike moves like the aerial uppercut, but they gain a few more ridiculously pointless abilities that just drive them even more insane. The red ones, for example, get the ability to pick up knives now and throw any weapon they're able to pick up. Oh, and if you try and throw something at them, they'll catch it. But what have I told you? It doesn't even end there, because we haven't even talked about the final version of this monstrosity of a character. The last version, known as Z, is worse than probably any boss in the game. Yeah, that's right. I think this version of Donovan is worse than bosses, especially when it comes to S ranks and speedrunning. This is because, 1, they're accompanied by a lot of health. They will do a lot of damage because they probably have a mace or a knife, which could do a third of your health if you're not careful. And worst of all, that OP aerial attack gets armor. So if it wasn't broken enough, now they're completely invincible doing it, and there's no way to deal with it if you're right next to them. Basically, if they throw this move out, which they usually have great AI to figure out where you are, you're pretty much gonna get hit no matter what. Oh, plus all the other things I've mentioned earlier. Oh, and did I forget to mention, you also fight them throughout the entire game, from the very beginning to the very end. So basically, you fight this super smart, super obnoxious, problematic character throughout the entire game. Yes, the entire game, just like Galaxias, but worse.
So this is just kind of my opinion of the enemies. Hope you liked it. Like I said, leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this issue. Take care.